When you build an application as a solo developer, you have plenty of control over where and how you deploy it. Maybe you pick a virtual private server, VPS, you go all in on a cloud service like AWS or Google, you stick it on a Raspberry Pi, or just keep with old faithful local host. These decisions are maybe inconsequential when you're working on your own, but when you're working with big teams or critical applications, they become really important. CTOs make these important infrastructure and platform decisions all the time, and they set the tone for engineering culture in the whole organisation. Today, we hear about how you can become a great engineer, the role of a CTO, and how to make great infrastructure decisions. Welcome to Programmable, where we talk to tech luminaries to help you with your career. Programmable is brought to you by JDoodle, the AI coding suite for learning and building together. Try our easy-to-use online coding environment, and you can start coding in 88 programming languages in seconds. I'm Lucas Hakewill, talking to John Ferlito. John has spent over 2 decades transforming startups into multi-million-dollar enterprises, from launching managed cloud services company Bulletproof Group and steering it to an ASX listing as co-founder and CTO, to his current role as co-founder of Gladly. John's career is a testament to great technical leadership. John, welcome.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. I'm really interested in this concept of a 10x engineer. Can you tell us a bit about what that means to you?
Yeah, look, it's one of those funny terms. I think some people like it and some people don't, but it's out there and people use it. So when I think about 10x engineers, I think about the journey of the career of an engineer. And it's the way I like to describe it is, moving from coder to developer to engineer to 10x engineer. And, not everyone makes it that full way. Not everyone wants to go that full way because there's more power, comes more responsibility, as they say. So the way I characterize a coder is, you've done uni degree or you've done your boot camp, you've learned how to code in JavaScript, Ruby, doesn't really matter. And, you'll be in a team, probably more likely in a team than working solo, and someone will give you a task and you'll implement that task. So you'll convert a story into a bit of code with business logic and, whatever's required to do the task. But that's sort of where you stop, right? You're really just doing that straight conversion, not really thinking about it or anything like that. Well, then think about that progression to developer, where it's a little bit more full-rounded, right? You understand a bit more about the business decisions behind the story that you've been given to implement. You might go back and question the product manager or your manager or whoever's required and so say, hey, they've wanted to put this button on the left, but every single other button in the app is on the right. Was that intentional? Was that something they forgot? There's this state which they haven't really thought about. What happens when you click this button, but you haven't ticked the box? Should it give an error message? So there's that more sort of thinking around the problem that you're trying to solve rather than just the raw implementation. I think when you get to that next level of engineering, I think that's going beyond just being a developer. It's being able to dig into the architecture. So how are we implementing this? What framework are we using? Do we use a third-party library? Do we write it ourselves? Thinking about performance problems. And I think going beyond, I think debugging is also crucial there, right? Being able to solve those problems. So a little bit more full-rounded. You hear about full-stack developers, that's sort of more in that engineering sort of side, I think, when you can deal with front-end and back-end. But also, I think, even though you're a software engineer, probably starting to delve into infrastructure a little bit as well and not being scared about that. So when you take 10x engineer, think it's all those things, but not being afraid to solve any problem, right? So I think, whereas in an engineering role, someone might come to you with a bunch of stories in Jira. In a 10x role, I might say to you, okay, we need payments in the application. And with just that single statement, you're going to be able to go away and implement that in your app with probably not a lot of more further direction. Now, for myself, for example, I can do that whole payment thing. It is going to look terrible. So I do need a designer to step in and make it look pretty and not like a horrendous, drawing that a 2-year-old did. But, apart from that bit, because I just don't have that mindset, that creative mindset, I think a 10x engineer can take, almost a single sentence understanding the business implications, the architectural implications, the coding implications, and take that to not probably the polished ready for production, but the MVP that you can show everyone in time and say, hey, it's done. Now a designer can say, make that blue, make that button bigger, move that to the left and the right, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so it's really building a better understanding of it's not just the how of how do we do things or the what of what we do. It's kind of also the why.
The why. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The why. Yeah. And that's the where as well, right? The, where is this going to go? What are the implications? It's not just like someone told me to do a task and I'm just going to implement it. It's like, well, let's do some thinking around this problem as well. And I think the other piece of 10x engineering is, here's a tricky problem that no one's been able to solve. You throw it at your 10x engineer and they just go, yeah, cool, I'm not going to stop until this is not a problem anymore.
Yeah, okay. So it's kind of that relentless willingness to either go down a rabbit hole or look at a problem from a very surface level and try to figure out what's the best solution.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Does this naturally come along with kind of a management skill set, or do you believe that they're very different things?
No, look, I think they're different. It's, as you grow in an organization, and this was always a problem we had at Bulletproof, you have 4 people in a team and it's like, okay, we need a manager, right? Because it's just not working anymore. And it's very tempting to go, okay, cool, we're going to take the most experienced engineer in the team and then they're going to manage the team. But, we talk about soft skills and all those sorts of things, but the skill sets to manage versus doing are very different, right? One's about comms, leadership. The other one's about, technical ability and being able to problem solve. So I think they're different. And I think it can be, it can be dangerous to just make that assumption of the most senior person is now the leader. I think it's almost critical in any organization to have a clear path. And you see the bigger guys doing this, you see principal architects, right? And it's like, this person is still an individual contributor. They're there just working for themselves and not doing any management, but they are the most senior person in the business, right? They could be on, $400,000, $500,000 a year, maybe earning $200,000 more than their manager because they have that deep technical know-how, and putting someone like that in a management position is almost a waste because they're then, dealing with all managing things, writing reports, budgets, managing people. I think they're very different skill sets.
So, John, there's this great progression from a coder to kind of an elite engineer who doesn't necessarily have to be a great manager, but they might be a great technical leader. What does it take for an early career developer to get there?
Yeah. So, look, for me, it's 2 things. I think number 1 is never stop learning, right? Our industry changes so quickly. There was a term I coined at Bulletproof, which is with public cloud and the rate that public cloud moves today, you incur technical debt by doing nothing. I've seen projects where you come back to them, 6 months later and you try and run the infrastructure as code stuff and everything just breaks because it's like I'm using tech that doesn't technically break, but doesn't work as well as it should because you're now using, a version of Kubernetes that's like 3 versions behind. So I think it's always learning, and whatever it is in your field and what you're interested in, and also sometimes something new, like, you see a new programming language pop up, go and have a play with it, see what it's like. So it's always learning because things move quickly. It's not, things don't change. I mean, look, I think there's very specific niches. Like if you're a COBOL programmer, you're probably making, pretty good money somewhere because there just aren't any of them anymore. But I think that's the rare case. But yeah, look, I think the other key for me along this journey and what's worked for me is, it's problem solving, but I think the part about problem solving and improving those skills is not giving up. And there's 2 sides to that, right? So dive deep into problems, like, understand them, work out why it's broken, take them to completion. But on the other side of that, don't hit your brick against a head wall. So don't hit your head against a brick wall for hours when you're getting absolutely nowhere, right? So, know when to put your hand up and ask for help. But, look, I'll give you an example. And like, I probably go through this every week, once or twice a week, with what I'm doing at Gladly, because I like to use cutting edge tech and we're definitely using cutting edge tech. So, great example was, last week, React Native 0.75 came out. I like to keep us on the cutting edge of React Native. So I went to go and try and upgrade that, right? And invariably, I'm doing it on the day of the release. Not many people have used the release candidates. I'm not quite that crazy. And you'll hit a bug, right? So you hit a bug. And in this case, I knew it was because of the upgrade, because I was doing the upgrade. But, in a different scenario, it might just be, day-to-day coding. You've updated a library or you're hitting some weird bug in the code. Now, it's very easy to go, okay, you work out the bug and you'll go, okay, I know this is because of the React Native upgrade or because of some extra bit of code I did. It's very easy to then jump on GitHub, file an issue and go, hey, here's the problem, and just move on. And either you're blocking the sprint that you're in, or maybe you've got a workaround, but it's, it's ugly. What I would say to people is like, dive into that problem. Like it's open source. Hopefully you're in an open source environment. Download the source code. See if you can patch the code in node modules to work around that issue. Go into a pull request. Always be problem solving. Always be trying to learn more and solve the problem. I think folks that give up too easily, you just don't end up learning because you learn so much along that process. And even if it's not open source, right? I'm an open source guy, so I tend to use Linux platforms. I'm on a Linux desktop right now. But if I've got an executable or a bit of code that I can't, look at the code or delve into, there's tools like strace. I can see what system calls the code is making, what files it's opening. Maybe it's going to open a file that doesn't exist, and I'm like, oh, it thinks the config file's over here when it really should be over here. Dump the network stack. Look at what's happening in Chrome Inspector in the browser. But there's so many tools that can help you debug and problem solve. So look, I think for me, the path on the journey is learn, always be learning, and don't give up. Don't give up too easily.
And so kind of applying that curiosity, and it sounds like part of that journey to being a great engineer is maybe at the start, like doing all of this is going to take you a long time. It will be a lot of banging your head against a brick wall, but you get to the point where you can do this really quickly. And maybe a junior coder isn't submitting a pull request to fix the latest version of React Native. But if you spend the time to look into it, maybe even in your own time while you're still studying, it gets you closer to that point more quickly.
Yeah, because you'll learn something along the way, right? Let's say that you are doing that pull request. They might have a special process. There might be a linting tool that they use to make sure it works right. They might have a specific commit structure. There might be some extra tool you've got to install to test it. So you'll learn about that. There's always some sort of learning element to going through that process. And look, I think you're right. In that early days, like it is hard. You literally, let's say you've done a uni degree or boot camp, you know nothing, right? I mean, I think it's the same in any sort of, profession. So I think that's where it's important to time box and go, okay, cool. I don't understand what's going wrong here. I'm going to bang my head against the wall for 20 minutes, an hour, whatever I think I've got available. And then I'm going to put my hand up and talk to a colleague or a manager. Because at the end of the day, I think you've got to realize, you are working for someone else. It's their dollars you're spending. Time is money. So, I've seen people spend days on stuff when someone could have pointed them in the right direction very quickly. So, and that's why things like Slack are great these days, right? It's just a quick question in the Slack channel. If you can help me with this problem.
Yeah, but I've committed 20 minutes to trying to solve this problem.
Yeah.
If I get it, I do. If I don't, I ask for help.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears a little bit and hear about Bulletproof Group. So you founded this very successful managed service provider, listed on the stock exchange. Can you give us a bit of a rundown of this? What did it look like?
Well, that's a long story. So look, I left Bulletproof 3 years ago. So at that stage, I'd been in the business, I think, for 21 years. And that includes, like, after we listed, we got acquired by AC3. So I stayed there for a couple of years, which was great. It was a great learning experience for me, actually. Look, when we started, we're very different to what that company is now. We were doing managed Linux gateways. So we would buy a bit of hardware from the local computer shop. We'd install Linux on it. It would be your router to configure your internet. It would do your a web proxy to save yourself bandwidth. It would be a mail server. It'd be the local file server for the business. So it was everything sort of a business sort of needed in one box. And look, we did quite a successful business doing that. We learned some hard lessons, like, managed services can be difficult and can take a lot of time. So, we went to the crazy extreme. Like, everything at Bulletproof, I think, along the whole life cycle was around managed services. So, I mean, that anything that was your problem was our problem, and monitoring of all those things, and also high availability, right? So it was a big thing for us that, nothing should ever fail. So with those managed gateways, for example, we would always have 2 internet links. We'd have like an ADSL and maybe a dial-up link for an ISDN as backup. And this was in the 2003s when ADSL was just existing in Australia.
It was fresh.
And it was flaky. It was super flaky. So you really needed that backup link. So look, one of the things I did there, and as I did, we had a patent pending piece of technology called Lifeline, which was a really hacky Perl script, which would, check the primary link. Has it gone down? It looks like it's gone down. Let's dial into that backup link and then flip back across. And if you had multiple sites, we had VPNs between the sites, and we would reconfigure those VPNs on the fly to make your your multi-site network still work. So, one of the learnings we had there is we used to even call your ISP if the link went down. That is insanely crazy. I would never recommend anyone doing that again. So look, that's where we started. We dropped those after a while and moved to sort of Cisco's and did the exact same thing with a sort of a Cisco router, because hardware is flaky and you don't want to do hardware maintenance. We did Linux, shared Linux and Windows web hosting for a while, and that was highly available. We had load balancers out the front, and this was before anyone did sort of high availability. Round about 2007, we built what we think is Australia's first managed virtual machine service. 2007's virtual machines were quite new. In fact, it was interesting. We started marketing these as virtual machines, and our sales went through the floor because no one knew what it was. So we actually had to sell it back as dedicated hosting, and then you'd have the conversation and you'd upsell the person on it's
wow.
it was just no one knew what it was. It was like our Google stats went through the floor.
You're educating a market.
Yeah, and it's difficult. When people are worried about competition, there's nothing worse than being in a market with no competitors, because people can't compare you to anything. They don't know if they're being ripped off or if the price is any good. They don't know what features they want. So yeah, that was interesting. So look, I think our strength became offering managed services in the digital and web space. So, we did that initially on our private cloud and VMware. We were very early to the mark on AWS managed services. So I think that was around 2012. I think I'd been playing with AWS since 2007. And then Azure after that. So, I think before we were acquired by AC3, our strength for digital and web, we had customers like Movember and Big W. We were managing their websites. And a bunch of DevOps pieces in there as well. And then when AC3 came along and acquired us, they were very strong in private cloud and government. So there was a very good sort of merging of two very different businesses, or complementary businesses, I should say. Sorry.
Fantastic. And so, but before something like Bulletproof existed,
yeah,
a company would literally have physical servers somewhere that they were managing, right?
Yeah.
You were this first sort of approach towards abstracting away the infrastructure and letting someone else manage it. Did you have to work hard to sell that vision, or was everyone kind of excited about this idea of
I think the Google problem was more people not understanding what it was. I think once you had the conversation, and you could tell the story of, well, if the physical hardware dies, well, the VM just boots up on a different piece of hardware that we've got. I don't remember it being a particularly difficult sell. I think we probably struggled with pricing originally and trying to get that right. But no, look, I think people came along on the journey. I think the tougher piece was always a high availability piece. Back in 2007, your website being down for a day was not really a big deal for your average business, especially the smaller businesses, so initial customers. Whereas now it would, be horrifying. Like, you're down for more than 5 minutes. It's like, what's going on? So yeah, that's probably what was a little bit different, I'd say, at the time.
Yeah, people's expectations were a little lower.
Yeah. I mean, look, the interesting thing that we saw that flow on, which I sort of thought might happen, was when people were on physical hardware, the interesting thing was every 3 to 5 years, you buy a piece of hardware, you typically get warranty on it for 3 years. You might extend that out to 5 years, but it meant that every 5 years you had this refresh cycle enforced on you, right? Where you would then upgrade and install the new operating system. Once you move to virtual machines, well, you can keep moving that virtual machine to the latest hardware and the latest hardware and the latest hardware. There's no inflection point that says you have to reinstall the operating system or upgrade the operating system. So it did mean, and I say it with embarrassment now, we had, Linux operating systems running on stuff that customers just would refuse to upgrade, would refuse to pay for upgrades that were maybe, 6 years, 7 years out of support. So it was a different mindset, and it took time. Like, we had to sort of change the products to sort of say, okay, there is this upgrade cycle, every 5 years, you are going to have to spend some money again to refresh this, or, the different models that we looked at. But, it's something that sort of died away because that inflection point disappeared.
That's really interesting. So, so it actually kind of enabled people to be really lazy about not upgrading their software.
Pretty much, right? Because there was there was no force point that went, well, your hardware's dead, we have to reinstall on the new hardware. And of course, if we're reinstalling, well, we're going to upgrade latest version of Windows, latest version of Linux. That went away.
It's just like you're using a very outdated version of Ubuntu.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
And it's difficult, especially in that smaller market. Like, you think your mum and pop shops with a small website for their business. someone that's paying, maybe $100 a month for that website saying, okay, you've got to spend another $2,000 or $3,000 again, reinstall, reset it up. They're like, but it's working.
Yeah.
The security piece is always hard to sell. I mean, it's probably easier now because people are much more aware of it. But, we didn't have phishing scams. We didn't have crypto locker scams back in the day. If a website got hacked, it was probably so someone could just, use it for storage or something or for some phishing site and, didn't really worry the customers. Just like, we'll just fix it. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, whereas the security stakes feel a little higher these days.
Yeah, very much so.
Talk to me about, I guess, for a coder or an early stage engineer, they haven't really made these kind of infrastructure decisions before necessarily. You've got some opinions on how people can make these kind of decisions for building their applications. What kind of tech stacks do you feel like are working these days?
I get to go my public cloud rant. Excellent. So look, I am very opinionated when it comes to this sort of stuff. So, I'm an open source guy, right? So, at uni, I got introduced to Linux, fell in love with it. I will tend to lean towards open source any day of the week. And I think we're it's interesting contrasting to like 10, 20 years ago. I think we're sort of there now, and it's not even decision. In a lot of spaces, it's the default, right? Like, if you're in web development, you're probably using React or Angular or Svelte. Everything you use is probably a node module on NPM. And I don't think the current generation of programmers is even thinking about, I'm using open source or I'm making a conscious decision. They just use it because it's what everyone does, which is great. I mean, I think that's amazing. So I think there's some obvious places. So open source is the first thing. I would lean towards open source when you can. For me, and it is, I think, something you appreciate more as an engineer. If something's broken, I can fix it, right? I can jump in there. I can either upgrade to the latest version myself. I can try and work out if there's a bug. I can understand why it's working. And if maybe I can't fix it, I can work around it. If I'm using proprietary software, I'm stuck. I'm dependent on a vendor to do something for me. Look, when it comes to hosting and infrastructure, I'm a massive AWS fan. I mean, they were my first cloud. I think my AWS account was created in 2007. So it's we're almost getting to 20. Yeah, almost getting to 20 years now. And I think AWS's philosophy and methodology of the building blocks they create maps to an open source philosophy. So it makes a lot more sense for me. Look, not to say it's perfect. There's a bunch of stuff that drives me crazy about how they work and what they do. But that's my preferred cloud. Look, not to say there's anything wrong with the others. Look, Google, I'm not a huge fan of. I suppose there's two things that always worry me. So until very recently, Google didn't use their own cloud for their own infrastructure. It was basically a product that they developed to sell to market. Whereas all the other guys, like, Amazon's cloud was born out of, Amazon's shopping stuff. It's it was the underlying infrastructure they started selling, and they still use it, right? They do a blog post every year about Prime Day, and how they scaled up for that day. And also Google has this tendency to kill products off. There's a well-known website called Killed by Google. I checked it this morning. There's 297 products, that Google has killed off. AWS, in contrast, I think has only recently started deprecating some things. And when you look at the list of things, they're like, yeah, no one really ever used that product. That sort of makes sense. And I think there's a philosophy at Google. I think it's easier to get locked into their ecosystem because Google is solving problems that probably 0.0001% of companies on the planet need to solve because of their scale. And some of the products in their cloud are based on those internal products and are probably overkill for most people. Look, Azure, just fine. If, I don't lean towards it because the philosophy is a little bit different. But if you're in a corporate Windows world, they're probably the better cloud to host on, versus AWS. They have had some security issues recently, which make me a little bit worried, but, at the same stage, they're not going to affect most people. They're working on those things. They've got a massive team. Definitely better than hosting any of this stuff yourself. So look, that's sort of my thoughts around hosting and public cloud hosting. And look, you've got your other guys, right? You've got your OVHs, you've got your DigitalOceans. By all means, if you're doing a little WordPress website and it doesn't need much resources, grab a DigitalOcean droplet and install it there and go for it. Or use WP Engine, even better, right? Then you don't have to manage any of it. Now, when it comes to corporate infrastructure, so your email, your saving your files, all that sort of stuff, I'm hardcore Microsoft Office 365 all the way. The value that you get from Office 365 subscription, or whatever they've renamed it to this quarter, is invaluable. You've got Google on the other side. I don't think they're quite as good. If I'm doing a budget or some sort of financial modeling, I can't move past Excel. So yeah, look, I think these are the key decisions. And then look, the other piece is around there's a bit of a build versus buy when you think about these things. And I've seen startups, hit this inflection point and go the wrong way before. So in your early days of your startup, it's all about MVP. How do we get to minimum viable product? And how do we get there as fast as possible? So the very first thing when someone's like, okay, so, the other day it's like, okay, we need comms in our app, right? The creators of our platform and the users, booking their services need to be able to communicate. So we need some sort of chat interface. So I could sit down for the next 2 weeks and I could implement, WebSockets and some sort of chat system and tables in the database. Or I can do 5 minutes of research on the web and I'll find someone like Getstream who's got an API that literally I can implement in half a day and I've got chat working in my app. And I think that's critically important in startup land in the early stage. And look, to be fair, also in larger corporates as well, who's already solved this problem that I can just pay to use their service. And look, sometimes you'll get to a scale where it's like, okay, you know what? This is now costing us $1 million a month. We know we can do it ourselves for less than that. At that stage, you've got money to burn. Go and do the cost saving exercise. But there's no point trying to build everything yourself at the smaller end.
Yeah, cool. So there's these balances of open source is, pretty amazing. I can debug myself. Everything's out there, but also at times, like maybe self-hosting everything, building everything from scratch, cobbling together open source. At some points, you might just want to buy an API and pay for that messaging API, at least while you're trying to scale up. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a faster path to market at the end of the day.
Cool.
And I suppose, look, probably the thing to do there to make it easier for down the path is put some sort of API, put some sort of abstraction layer in front of it, right? So, make sure that you've got a file. Let's take the chat example. You're going to have some sort of file that's going to have a couple of functions like, send a message, check for messages, try and put some abstraction in front of whatever that third party is and put the implementation in there. So then if down the track it's like, okay, either we've got to switch to our own or we've got to switch to, we want to switch to something else because of the better and a cheaper SaaS platform out there, you've got some sort of abstraction layer that you can just almost flip in.
You haven't hard coded in something that's really opinionated to one API.
Yeah, and look, I think this is the same argument you hear a lot about, public cloud, right? So, I go all in on AWS and people go, oh, but you've got vendor lock in there, right? You're locked into AWS. And it's like, well, yeah, I am. But 10 years ago when we were deciding to use MySQL versus Oracle, well, that was vendor lock-in and we didn't worry about it then. So why are we so focused on it with public cloud? And I think if you look at the individual building blocks on public cloud, if you do a similar sort of abstraction layer and you're coding sensibly, AWS has a queuing product, Azure's got a queuing product, Google's got a queuing product. They all have queues. You put something in, you get something out the other end. They're not fundamentally different. Even if you don't have an abstraction layer, like switching one out with the other shouldn't be weeks and weeks of work. It should be a couple of days if things, work well. Not always, but sometimes.
You're building Gladly. It's an app for content creators to build their income stream. What were some of the biggest mistakes or challenges that you had when you were building your tech stack? Is there anything you would do differently?
I would probably, so we're using React Native to do our Android and iOS apps. So very recently, React Native have basically said, hey, stop using React Native there. We now consider ourselves an underlying core element. You should use a framework that sits on top. So Expo is probably the most popular one, and they've been blessed by the React Native team. I'm sure over the next couple of months, we'll start to see some other frameworks pop up because React Native themselves are doing a lot of work around, what does a React Native framework need to do to be blessed by us as a framework? So what I've implemented in our code base is effectively a React Native framework, right? I've picked a navigation library. I've picked a UI library. I've picked a CSS and a styling library. So I think I wish I had picked Expo early on. I think I avoided it. Look, Expo wasn't anywhere near as good as it is now back then, but I think that would have saved us a lot of textual decisions and having to work out what library to pick. So I think that's probably one piece. I think the other short-sighted thing we probably did was not thinking that we needed to have a web presence. So like, we've got our marketing website, but until probably 3-4 months ago, you had to install the app. And I think that can work in some cases, but as we pivoted a couple of times to our current piece, it's like, no, we have to have, we've got to have a website, right? I think the people that want to monetize a skill or a service they've got, they're going to be willing to install the app, right? They're going to be making money out of this. They're going to have the best experience there. But if someone is booking them off their web profile, installing that app is where people are going to block off. So we have to have that sort of piece on the web. So that's probably been our main focus for the last 4 months.
Yeah, makes sense. Like, I guess reducing some of the friction for someone who's not that committed to using the app. Have you done any kind of measurement or user testing there? Like, what's that look like? Is that a gut feel hunch on, nobody's going to install the app just to book something, or did you kind of get some insight into how people are using Gladly so far?
Yeah, look, we don't have anywhere near a big enough user base. It's sort of early days for us. While we've been around for a while, we've pivoted a couple of times. So it's early days for us on this new skills monetization piece. So look, no objective data where like, I've got analytics going to a backend system that I can point to and say, this is really obvious. But you sort of, it yourself, right? Like, people click on a link and it's like, I've got to install an app. Do I really want to again? And like, we hear this anecdotally from Gen Z all the time. They don't like installing apps unless, so there's research out there that speaks to it. But it's sort of been sort of a gut feel. Like, you're literally, we were in a stand up and said, hey, someone just sort of said, hey, I feel like this is going to be a blocker for us. People will not want to install the app just to book someone. And we're sort of like, yeah, you know what, that feels right. So yeah, let's go and do the hard yards. We're going to have to do it at some stage anyway. So, let's do that now.
You have to make gut feel decisions sometimes.
You do. You don't have, when you've got, it'd be great, when you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, you can look at your data, you can throw a survey out there and like, maybe a day later, you've got like, okay, we've got a real data point. But in the early days, you just got to go with your gut and your experience.
We had an interesting, I suppose, an infrastructure decision to make. We use a tool called PostHog, which is an open source product analytics tool to see, how many people are clicking this button and is this particular feature usable to people? And they give you the option to self-host versus to use the hosted service. And it was this trade-off of, hey, do we want to, pay a significant amount to get this hosted, managed by someone else, get some better features, versus do we spin up an AWS instance and host it ourselves? And we kind of landed halfway between. We tried self-hosted. We've decided to move back to hosted. So it's really interesting kind of living that decision of how much extra work it is maybe to self-host something versus just having it managed for you.
And I think it's that trade-off in those early days, right? Especially with something like that where you've got that easy decision, right? If the same software is going to work exactly the same way, we can manage it or they can manage it. It really comes down to, well, how much money do I have in the bank account, right? And if you can afford to have them host it, that for me, and it's assuming you don't have any data sovereignty or any requirements around like, we have to have 100% control of the data. It's almost a no-brainer to go the hosted option if there's no downsides. But, when you're bootstrapping and there's not much cash in the bank account, then it's like, well, you know what? My time is actually cheaper. I can work till 1 a.m. instead of midnight and, make that thing work.
Yeah, for sure. When you don't have much money as a startup, it is important to bootstrap, to move fast, get to an MVP, work in kind of a hacky way. But you think that there are some technologies or processes that it's worth getting right at the start versus kind of just patching them together. What do you think was really worth the effort?
Look, the biggest one for us, two things that come to mind for me. And it's funny because when you're implementing these things, and sometimes they're tricky, and you're sitting there for days, you're like, oh, I could be writing code that's getting out there to the website or the app, and like, is what I'm doing worth it? But I think the biggest one that paid off for us is I think over the last 2 years, I've probably spent probably 3 weeks full time making this work properly over the years. But it's getting the app onto people's phones. So I've got a full GitHub Actions build pipeline. So let's say I've worked on this today's sprint or whatever I'm working on today. I can commit that code to our main branch. I can merge that branch to our development branch, and there's a GitHub Actions pipeline I've created that will automatically test that code, build that code, upload it to the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store, and then it will be on people's phones with test flight. If it's a full app build where I'm building the whole app, that'll be there like 6 minutes later. If I'm just doing a code push for just the small code change we've made, that'll be on people's phones a minute later. So it felt like almost a waste of time doing that at the time if I had to explain it to someone, because I can get a lot of actual features done in the app in the week. It probably took me to get that working. But it's meant that over the last 2 years, when the guys ask me to do something, I can literally have it on their phones 5 minutes later for them to test and play with. In fact, we do this thing internally. We haven't done it for a little while, called a design workshop, where I'll screen share, and I've got my editor, NeoVim, if anyone's wondering, up on one half of the screen, and I've got our, the Android emulator sitting on the other side of the screen, and I go to those, okay, what do you not like about the app? And I'll go, okay, that button is too big, and I go, cool. It's really nice with React Native. As you're changing the code, the simulator refreshes in real time, and you'll see the changes half a second later. So move that button more to the left, that spacing's not quite right. And I'm doing that in real time. So they're seeing that in real time. And then I'll commit and merge. And a minute later, they're seeing what it looks like on their phone. But sometimes the emulator is not quite, the same as having it on a real phone. That has just the efficiencies from automating that entire process end to end, versus having to jump into Xcode, hitting compile, jumping into the App Store, clicking the buttons to make it all work. That saved us bucket loads of time. The other one for me, which hasn't reaped rewards yet, but I still think it's worth it, is we set up a data warehouse really early. I've got a Postgres database, costs us $50 a month. I'm using Fivetran, which is a great tool to pull. So Fivetran's a data transformation ELT sort of tool. So it's a SaaS tool. It will talk to Reddit, LinkedIn, HubSpot, the app stores. You think of a SaaS platform out there, it's got a connector for it, and it'll pull that all back into the data warehouse. Now, we've only got some really basic reports because we don't know what we don't know. And sometimes it just sits there for months and we don't look at it. But we're collecting all that data. So when we get to a stage where it's like, actually, we need to know, we've got a question that we don't know an answer to, it's just there waiting for us. So I think having, being data-driven can be a lot of work, but if you can easily set up the foundations there, so the data's just sitting there in a database, and if someone's got a question, it's like, well, I just need to fire up Power BI and work out which tables the data's in and create a query, then at least it's there and you can answer those questions. Whereas if you don't have anything, then the moment you ask the question, sure, you can set up the report in the data warehouse, but now you've got to wait 3 weeks for the data to accumulate. Having it just talk to every tool you're using and just pull everything in, it's pretty easy to do. And I think you will reap the rewards of that down the track.
Just knowing that you have that data available to make a retrospective query, as opposed to deciding we need to know about, I don't know, users' location or their demographics, and then waiting 3 weeks. It sounds like those two things were they're both kind of a little bit of technical work to set up a system that helps you move faster with making product decisions.
And look, I think to summarize, it's automation, right? So if you look at something and you go, it's an interesting conversation I used to always have as CTO at Bulletproof, right? And someone will come to you and say, hey, I've got this thing I think we can automate. And every time they'd say that, I'd look at that and go, okay, cool. To automate that thing, well, maybe that's going to take 3 months, which, maybe let's just throw some numbers. Let's say that costs $100,000. And then I might go, yeah, you know what, we could automate it, but there's someone that we pay minimum wage. It takes them 5 minutes a day to do. So it's literally costing us $1,000 a year. Why would we spend $100,000 to save $1,000 a year? Now, if it's error prone and they get it wrong 50% of the time, then maybe it is worth it, because the making it always correct is more important. But you've always got to do that sort of trade-off. So I think it's the same thing in a startup. It's like, automate as much as possible where you can see the future benefit, but not if it's like, the future benefit's tangible.
Yeah, you got to make that sort of ROI decision.
Yeah. And it's the same with the build versus buy, right? It's always an ROI decision, except it's not always just money. It's sometimes time because that can be more important in startup land than cash.
Time or risk of error.
Yeah.
So you use NeoVim,
Yes.
Fivetran, Postgres. Talk to me about some of the tools that you love using.
So I'm definitely a NeoVim text editor guy. I came from Vi. I've got a pretty nicely configured NVim setup with LSPs and everything else. So it's probably as good as VS Code, which I think everyone probably defaults these days, but probably 1,000 times faster. So that's my editor of choice. I think in general tools, look, Sentry is my favorite debugging and analytics tool. So if you're running a web app or some sort of app out there, you want to know when things crash. You want to know how long things take. Like that data is just invaluable. I mean, we've got that data going into a Slack channel, so we can keep an eye on it and pushing. No, we don't have it pushing straight into Jira, but it does link up with Jira. So something like Sentry, like there's Rollbar, there's a couple of others out there. I think Sentry is awesome. If you don't know when stuff is going wrong, you're losing users that are just walking away when stuff is going wrong. So I think that one's critical. Fivetran's great for the data warehouse. Probably my favorite tool is CDK on AWS. So CDK is AWS Cloud Development Kit. I probably came across it 5 or 6 years ago. So in AWS world, there's a thing called CloudFormation. So CloudFormation is a YAML file with which you can describe your infrastructure. Probably 80% of AWS services support CloudFormation. So you can sort of say, I need an EC2 instance and a VPC, and I've got this Lambda, and I've got the code for that Lambda, that Lambda function is in an S3 bucket, and it will, you upload that YAML file to AWS's CloudFormation service, and it in the background has a bunch of code that just sits there and makes it all happen and creates your infrastructure. So it wasn't quite infrastructure as code, even though that's what we called it. I would say it's more infrastructure as config. So CDK is basically either TypeScript or Python, or I think even Java and Go you can use it in. And you can actually describe your infrastructure using JavaScript, which is great, right? Because you can say, okay, I've got a particular Lambda function, and I always pass it the same arguments, right? So in the CloudFormation, you would have 20 lines of code every single time. I can write a function that says, okay, here's the CDK function you call to create a Lambda. Here's the same arguments that I call it every time, and I can wrap that and then just have one single function saying, here's the file, make that into a Lambda. So you can actually describe your whole your code. It'll tell you the changes that it's going to make before you deploy it. It's true infrastructure as code. You've got the power of a function or procedural programming language wrapped around your code infrastructure. There's even tests. So you can test that it's actually doing what you think it wants to do. Which means, like, theoretically, I can tomorrow go, you know what, our entire application, I need that to run in the Singapore region, and I can bring up a whole new copy of that. We've done it from scratch in a while, so you'll always have issues, but for the iterative stuff, it's amazing. For going from scratch, you're going to have some things that you have to fix because code stagnates over time. But no, look, CDK is probably one of my other favorite tools. I don't know, name a problem space. I've probably got a tool that
Sweet.
I love to use in that space.
What distro are you running?
So I am running Ubuntu currently. I've got a brand new framework laptop, which I got on the weekend.
Framework.
Yeah. I pick it up and it's running the podcast and it's got a lot of cables plugged in, so it will probably break things. Yeah, my stepson got a 16-inch framework about a year ago. And I like the ethos. I love what they're trying to do around the repairability. The modular stuff for the I/O connections is great. It's a really great laptop. So I've got that. So it's running Ubuntu 24 4. I was a Debian guy way back. I think it was my first main distribution. Like, I think I'd use Slackware, which I don't even know if Slackware still exists, and Red Hat back in the day. Debian's the distro that sort of made sense for me. I moved to Ubuntu probably 10 years ago because I liked the rolling point releases, right? Versus sometimes with Debian, you're sitting on stable or unstable, and it's just very, very iterative. You're getting new stuff all the time. Yeah. I like some of the design decisions they made. It was a really cool, it's my favorite distro. There's some stuff they've done in recent years that I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not a huge fan of snaps, but you can make those go away. But yeah, look, I've been running a Linux-based desktop for the last 15 years. Used to be on MacBooks, then I used the Dell XPSs, now frameworks, probably my future thing forever, hopefully. But yeah, I think I find it crazy when I see folks trying to do web development on Windows, and I'm like, just the core tools are missing. I mean, you can see that because like they've created WSL, right, the Windows subsystem for Linux, where you can effectively run a VM inside the core thing. So it's yeah, I think it's a great dev environment. It's a great desktop environment. The only thing that I miss is Word and Excel. They're probably the two apps that I wish Microsoft would release for Linux. I feel like they're heading in that direction because it's all starting to use, like Microsoft is a huge investor in React Native for Windows. So like in Windows 11, like the settings application in Windows 11 is actually a React Native app. So they're making a huge investment there. So I know, fingers crossed, maybe one day Windows and Word will come to Linux. But yeah, that's why I've got my Windows VM that I'll fire up and use that when I need to jump into a serious spreadsheet.
One day you'll be able to do your financial modeling in Ubuntu.
It'd be so good. It would be so good.
Amazing. John, do you have any final advice for early career engineers who are listening?
So I think I've covered some of it, but I think for me, it boils down to engineering. And look, I think it doesn't matter what discipline of engineering you're talking about, right? It could be, civil engineering, chemical engineering. It's about solving problems, right? And the better you are at solving problems, the better an engineer you will become. So I think, don't let the problem beat you. I mean, I think that's the most, if someone says to me like, why do you think you're successful, or what's your strongest attribute? I think it's problem solving. Like, I will not let a problem beat me. If I've got to spend days on it trying to solve it, like I will at least get to the stage of understanding it, if not solving it. And look, I think that's why that's so important in your career development is every time you're diving deep, solving a problem, learning a new tool, you're learning something. Every single time you'll learn something new. And yeah, I don't think there's anything more valuable than constant learning and developing those skills as you're trying to progress through your career.
Fantastic. If our listeners want to find you or Gladly, where can they keep track of you?
Gladly, we're at gladlyapp.com and on all of the social medias because we have to be. Me personally, look, LinkedIn is probably the best person. I used to be on Twitter and all the other things, but I don't know. I'm one of these people where social media is just too much hard work. So yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best place to reach out.
We'll share links to all of those in the show notes. You've been listening to Programmable, a podcast by JDoodle. If this has got you tempted to start coding, jump into jdoodle.com to start coding. Follow John and his journey at Gladly, and you can follow the Programmable podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. John, thank you so much for your time. It was such a great conversation.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks for having me. It was lots of fun.